start all of our programs by reading a statement about the difficult situation that we all find ourselves in, both, as an organization, as a people, as a country. And Sandy Spring is one of the many organizations that is faced with many challenges this year. We stand firmly with those fighting against racism, structural disadvantages, and systemic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of those of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of a historically unjust system, and we're committed toward dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a more just and equal society. Tonight's program is just one of many programs that we'll be hosting that challenge the dominant narrative. So with that, I want to give a little bit of background about how this program came to be. Some of you might be aware that the Sandy Spring Museum is doing a research project on the 17 historically Black communities that were in Sandy Spring towards the late 1800s up until the early 1900s when they were really flourishing. And now there's only a couple of really historically Black communities that are still standing in the area. So we're trying to document as many as possible. And you can see this, this research is on our website now. But what we realized through the course of our research, which other people may have been already aware of, was that the Olney Theater was built right on the edge of Davis Corner, which was one of the historically Black communities in Sandy Spring. So we just started to wonder why that was the case and if there was any connection between the story of race and integration at the theater. But while we were researching the background for this program, we also came across a few mentions of the history of the theater in the museum's archives that speak to the earliest days of the theater. Laura, could you go to the next slide? So this comes from an organization that called themselves the Community Council of the Sandy Spring Neighborhood, otherwise known as the Neighbors. And this is from their minutes from January 29th, 1937. Under new business, the question of the proposed theater on the Harry Davis property was brought up and brought forth much discussion. A special committee consisting of Mrs. Weld, Joseph Jones, and Oland Harvey was appointed to investigate and report on this matter. It is also requested that all affiliated organizations report on this matter, which is one that may be of vital importance to the community as a whole. Next slide. So this is from February 26th, probably their very next meeting, also 1937. The special committee appointed to report on the theater project reported that in a letter from Mr. Cochran stated that the property has not yet been bought, but that an option is still held. The proposed theater will be conducted on the same lines as the National Theater in Washington, and Mr. Cochran will be glad to appear before the Community Council in case the project is continued and give the facts concerning the proposed building and its operation. Next slide. It gets worse. June 9th, 1938. Bentley Thomas said he had met Mr. Stephen Cochran, promoter of the Olney Theater project, and asked what the neighbors thought of the sign on his property locating the theater. After a lengthy discussion, Bentley learned of the pros and cons and will no doubt do what will detract the least from the environs. William Moore remarked that he felt Sandy Spring was losing its identity, which I'm sure we hear very frequently. I'm just going to read one more, which is on a slightly different subject, but I just thought it was worth sharing because it shows that the theater is moving forward. So last slide. This is February 24th, 1939. The secretary was asked to write the secretary of the liquor board asking to be notified when and if the Olney Theater applies for a beer license. So, we know that you did at some point.
Years later.
Well, yes. Early earlier than you thought, maybe. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest speakers. We have Mark Walston, who is a former county historian, and he is the lead historian on our Historically Black Communities project of Sandy Spring. We have Jim Petosa. Jim is a professor at Boston University School of Theater. He served as the director of it from 2002 to 2019 and was the artistic director at the Olney Theatre from 1994 to 2012, the New Repertory Theatre from 2011 to 2019, and the co-artistic director of the Potomac Theater Project from 1987 to the present. And we have Weldon Brown, who has worked at the theater for the past 30 years and is actually the longest standing employee at the theater. And many of you probably know him as the sales director, although he has worked in many different related positions since his time joining the theater staff. So I'm going to start my first question to Mark. What can you tell us about the community that was standing there at the time that the theater was built?
I think we need to keep in mind, as we talk about the history here, that Montgomery County was part of the South. Maryland was part of the slave-holding South, and in Montgomery County, that came with everything that you could imagine. Sandy Spring, from the late 18th, early 19th century, was a much more tolerant community. Yet Sandy Spring remained a white village, only remained a white village. So for free Blacks in the early 19th century, they started to congregate in the space in between, at the intersection of what was the old Market Road to Baltimore, which is Route 108 now, and the old Market Road to Bladensburg, which is Dr. Bird Road right now. That point right in the middle became the center of the Black community. From about the 1850s onward, the Owens family lived right at that point. Samuel Owens is interesting. He was a corporal in the Union Army, a free Black who fought in the Civil War. They were joined across 108 and down Dr. Bird by the Awkward families, the Riggs, the Snowdens, the Powells, the Mitchells. There was about a dozen houses or so that had formed right there at the corner, the intersection of Dr. Bird and 108. It remained a Black community throughout the mid-19th century following emancipation. It wasn't really until the end of the 19th century that white residences started to be built within the community. One of the first ones was what's known as the Actors' Residence at Olney Theatre, which was originally the Davis House. Henry and Elizabeth Davis built it around 1897, and they're the ones that gave their name to the community as David's Corner. Unfortunately, Henry died right after his house was built in 1897, so his widow lived there for a long time. She eventually turned it over to her niece, who took the Davis house and turned that into the Woodlawn Lodge, a place where people could come and enjoy the serene rural environment of Sandy Spring. But the first real intrusion came in 1924, when Samuel Owens' house, right in front of Samuel Owens' house, the free Black, right on the corner, the what is now the Olney Ale House was built in 1924. Strictly a white establishment. Blacks were served out of a window in the back, but Samuel Owens' log house still stood in the parking lot right behind what is now a white establishment. That sort of was the inroad there for what eventually became this, you could call it an entertainment center at Davis Corner, with the restaurant, the Olney Ale House in one corner. You had what was the Woodlawn Lodge, which is the old Davis house. There was apparently a wooden roller skating rink built behind the Actors' Residence's house. It remained that way up until the early 20th century. Slowly, the Black families that had lived there moved away from the area. Infill came down Dr. Bird Road with white residences. Eventually then, in 1936, the Olney Theatre came and took over the Davis property. There were still two Black houses on the back end of the Olney Theatre property when they bought it, the houses of the Riggs. they conveyed, actually, two of them conveyed with the property. So by the 1930s, we have white restaurants, white theater, white inns. Everybody came out to Sandy Spring for the serene and rural character of it. Steve Cochran, who's the man who founded the Olney Theater, he picked that location not only because of the rural serenity, but because it was halfway between Baltimore and Washington. He thought that would be a good location for people to come and see the performances at the theater.
So what we know about it is that from the very beginning, it was classified as an integrated theater. Jim, do you want to speak to that? How that came to be?
Oh, can I?
Yeah.
Can I mention something?
Yep.
I just wanted to mention that we think Montgomery County is a progressive place, but it wasn't until the early 60s that things became integrated. Bethesda, which thought of itself as a progressive community, the Heiser Theater down there, remained segregated until 1961, and the owner, Jack Heiser, refused to integrate, and he'd rather sell the theater than to integrate. So while we have in Down County in the 60s, we have this integration going on. Up here in Sandy Spring in the 30s, we have what looks like the beginning of an integrated theater.
That's what's so unusual. So I know there's a story behind it. I don't know if it's legend or truth, but it'd be great to share the story.
Yeah, there is, whenever you talk about the history of Olney Theater, I was talking to our panelists when we first met a couple of weeks ago, that there is always a fascinating tension between assertions of fact and assertions of lore. And everything about Olney Theater's history exists in the realm of legend, and most of it is an oral tradition of stories. And it's kind of fitting that people of the theater would guard their history by an oral tradition of one generation passing the stories of the theater on to the next, without necessarily ever writing them down. So a lot of the knowledge, I even hesitate to use the word knowledge, that I have about Olney Theater, I do have in my brain a repository of the lore that is Olney Theater's imagined history, and I'm sure it's half evangelization and half born of truth. But it makes it quite fascinating. It is always intriguing to me as someone who has been, I first attended the theater as an audience member as an undergraduate student at the Catholic University drama program in the summer of 1973. So that was my freshman year. And Olney Theater was then a separate and independent concern, but deeply connected to that renowned drama program, one of the leading drama programs in the country at the time. And we became fascinated with the culture of this summer theater. We have to remember, this was, Washington is not a pleasant place to be in the summer months before the days of air conditioning. And I can't imagine Baltimore was very different. So the theaters that functioned in both cities tended to shut down during the summer months because they were unbearably hot. So people would seek the respite of the countryside, and Olney's location being in this rural, rather undeveloped spot between these two fairly large cities and culturally ambitious cities, had a logical place to be, the place where Washington and Baltimore audiences would go to spend their summers in a summer stock tradition. The Steve Cochran era was really very brief, and I have a funny story, a fascinating story about that. I used to have a little escape place in Rehoboth Beach that I used to go to because we seldom had enough time to be able to be away from the theater to have a real vacation. So we would settle on having a couple of days out in Rehoboth to just get away from the workload. And one day I was out there And it was actually New Year's Eve, and I'm walking the beach, and I sat down. It was a 60-degree day on a December 31st. This would have been in the early 90s. And fellows walking by, we start talking, and he asked me what I did. I said, oh, I am an artistic director over at the Olney Theatre Center. And he said, oh, my name is Steve Cochran. And he was the grandson of the Steve Cochran founder. This is totally a fluke. And he says, my grandfather founded the Olney Theatre. And I said, who's your grandfather? And I leapt to C.Y. Stevens, who I'll get into in a little bit. And he says, Steve Cochran. And that name didn't even mean anything to me. And I found out more about the history and found out everything that Mark just shared with us. But it was a relatively brief period of time because of the Second World War. Olney as a theater shut down. So it didn't function for many years under Steve's leadership. But the most compelling part of his vision that seemed to endure, that didn't get mentioned in any of the wonderful minutes that were shared at the beginning of this conversation, was he imagined a synergy between an operating professional theater and a place where theater would be studied, that Olney would exist to serve audiences, but also to serve a next generation of theater makers. So its educational professional mission was in its DNA at its very foundation through the brain trust of Steve Cochran's initial vision. And that has proven to be an enduring part of the Olney Theater legacy. After the war, the theater was purchased by C.Y. Stevens, the then magnate of the old Hayes dairy stores. Hayes was, for those of you who may not remember Hayes stores, it was 7-Eleven before 7-Eleven. There were Hayes all over the region. They were, you went in there to get your newspaper, your milk, your fast food, your cigarettes, whatever you needed, you got at Hayes. And CY was, for all intents and purposes, the real founder of the post-World War II Olney Theater era, when many of its legendary performers, the people who are on the list of Broadway and Hollywood legends who appeared at Olney Theater, that was during that summer stock era, when Olney did not do a lot of producing, but did a lot of presenting in the old summer stock circuit, where shows would get a week or 2 week run, and there might be 8 of them over the course of the summer. And we still have a ton of old programs from that era. But by the late 40s, that model was starting to fray, and CY was finding it increasingly difficult to keep the theater solvent. So at that point in time, he approached the then chair and founder of the Catholic University Drama Department, a Dominican priest, Father Gilbert Hartke, and said, look, I will give this over to you. I'll continue to own it, but if you can make this theater viable, I will give it to you. And they created a separate 501c3 nonprofit corporation, independent of the university. It's, the Olney Theatre Center is still that corporation. We renamed it, but it's the same entity that they created back then in 1951. And for the next 10 years, Hartke and his team produced a strategy and a business plan that enabled the theater to survive and survive reasonably well without incurring terrible losses during that period. And CY was true to his word and ultimately gave the theater over to Hartke. And that is the entity that has run the theater since that time. The reason that's important is to get back to the story of integration. Helen Hayes, legendary First Lady of the American stage, counted DC as her home, her birthplace. She was a a devoted citizen of the district, and the Helen Hayes Awards bears her name because of her deep affinity and loyalty to her hometown. And she was an incredibly spiritual woman and devout Catholic, and detested the notions of segregation that existed in the American theater in the South which was par for the course during that era. And the legend has it that she was slated to do a show at the National Theater in DC, which was a segregated theater, and she decided she would not do that because she couldn't participate in it. And she had also a deep and abiding friendship with Father Hartke. And the two of them forged their relationship based on their convictions that the theater should not be a place that segregates people and creates different classes of citizens. And the Olney Theater became a place that its policy was to always admit all people who wanted to come and see plays there. And Hartke would talk about that a lot for many, many years. He lived until 1986, and he was full of stories. And that story was high on his list and was never far from his lips when he would talk about Helen Hayes and her relationship with the theater. And the two of them, I think, were quite happy with the fact that they had a professional theater, which the old programs used to call, America's premier summer stock theater of the South. So Mark's talking about, you have to remember, this was a Southern place, is very true. The ethos of it was quite something. And even though it predates my time, so I never had an actual experience of it, but there used to be a very high-end restaurant called the Olney Inn, which functioned culturally like an old Southern manse and an old Southern plantation, and it had all the cultural rubrics of that kind of society, which the Ale House kind of was a reaction to that in some ways. But that place burned down in another, that fire is filled with legend and lore as well. That is an interesting part of the region's story. But it was never replaced, and it was certainly an artifact of its time. But the theater has grown and grown and grown, and has gone year-round since that kind of summer stock days when the scenery was built outdoors on a cement slab, and we would dig trenches to keep the water from rainstorms flooding into the first rows of the theater, because that's what it used to do. And now it has managed to grow with the neighborhood. I remember my earliest years working at the theater, standing in the front counting the deer across the 2-lane 108, the deer that would congregate at dusk in the field across which is now Good Counsel High School. And the highest number I ever counted was 42 deer one evening. So that gives you a sense of just how rustic this place was.
I'm going to interrupt and bring Mark into for some perspective on how unusual was this to have an integrated theater, as you said, in the South at this time, and particularly in the context of Sandy Spring, what was going on in the community at that same time that Helen Hayes made her stand.
This was a segregated county. It was a segregated county for most of its history. As I said before, it'd be unusual for the Olney Theater to adopt a full integration policy at a time when restaurants in Rockville were segregated. Like I said, theaters in Bethesda were segregated. Glen Echo Amusement Park out on the river, totally segregated. This is all 25 years after the theater adopted, apparently, this policy of integration. Like I said, Sandy Spring was a more tolerant community, even though the village of Sandy Spring itself was all white, and the blacks in the community were forced into essentially geographic segregation on the outskirts of the towns, not in the centers of them. So the Olney Theater came and placed itself right in the middle of that segregation. Olney even more so, because Olney wasn't a Quaker village, whereas the Friends had a more tolerant view towards blacks and integration.
So what would people have been doing socially? Would it have been common for Black people and white people to go to the same social institutions?
No, what we're finding in our study is that in each of these communities, they made their own entertainment. They had almost each one had a meeting hall in it, a secular meeting hall. The church would be there, the school would be there, they'd be opened up as well. Some of these communities had their own stores. Some of these communities had their own bars and restaurants. That was where their entertainment was. They never came into, say, the center of Sandy Spring, to have a beer. That wouldn't happen, particularly since Sandy Spring was dry as well, which apparently caused a problem with the actors at the Olney Theater, because they had to drive a long way to get themselves some alcohol.
Interesting. So Weldon, can you speak to what in your history, what kind of milestones have you seen that pertain to racial equity? What changes have you seen during your tenure at the theater?
Well, I mean, access has always been one of the stumbling blocks to create the kind of access that would be inviting to everyone. And when I first came in '96, Jim had already started doing that with some of his choices for roles in shows. They talk about now about people getting woke, WOKE. The theater community has been woke for a long time. We just started to tiptoe into it, and now it's becoming a little bit more and more. But Jim had some interesting choices for people that he wanted to see in different roles that were traditionally, not African American or BIPOC. And I saw that, and Jason has brought that same kind of mentality. Like, I was floored when he chose Nicole Robinson to be the Annie. And it was the first time that we actually had the poster board outside with a picture, and it had this African-American Annie. And, there's lots of talk and but it was lots of buzz. And, it was one performance where she got sick and her understudy went on, who was not African-American. The people there that day had a fit. We came to see Black Annie, and now it's, I feel kind of blessed that I'm in this right now, because I can see how all these things cultivated into what's happening right now. One of the things that we are doing as a theater is addressing social upheaval, the protests, and racial justice. And we have been all through October doing a celebration of art and activism, Just Arts, which is led by and produced and performed by BIPOC artists. BIPOC, just in case anybody doesn't know what that means, it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it's just been exciting. The first two were great. This tomorrow at 7, it's free. All you have to do is go to our website and click on it. And I love the fact that where theater has gone now is not so much to be preaching, but to be inviting people into voices that they haven't heard before. It's really dynamic time right now.
Somebody from the audience asked a question that I've been dying to know the answer to also. Did many Black people attend the theater when it was first opened? you know, I don't know if anybody in the meeting tonight attended when they were kids and remembers that there was there were a lot of different people of color, but it'd be really interesting to know, you know, how far back did people feel comfortable going to the theater? Can't speak on that.
I mean, I can say from when I came in 96,
Sure.
you know, it really was dependent on the title. Everything depended on the title. If it was an exciting title, people came of all races, nationalities. And it's one other thing I just want to say real quick. We did a production called Tiger Style. It was a pretty new comedy with a full Asian cast. And it was hilarious. It did not really take root until the last week of the show when people started finding out because they never heard of it. So and then it was really interesting to see how that audience really embraced it towards the end because the word of mouth started getting out that it was great.
Mm-hmm. So when Jim, you started making you know, some interesting changes in terms of either casting or show choice, was there negative feedback from the community, or did you feel like it was positive, or it's just all a matter of evolution and acceptance?
Well, you know, my tenure as artistic director was a time of tremendous expansion for the theater in terms of going from 4 months of operation to then 7 months of operation to then 12 months of operation. So the idea of expansion, both in the calendar and in the facilities. I mean, we went from that one theater to these 4 performance venues over, you know, several decades of time it took to develop that 14 acres. The idea of expansion became physical expansion, and calendar expansion became metaphors for aesthetic expansion. That the whole idea of the theater encompassing a broader spectrum of possibilities. So yes, telling African-American based stories became important, but so did LGBT stories needed to be told from that stage. So I remember, you know, at one period of time, it was okay if I programmed a play with a gay central character as long as they had a miserable end and they died at the end. If it was a comedy, forget it. You know, if there was poetic justice, you could do it. If it was showing this was normal, happy, and a good way of being, you'd get resistance. So I share that with the notion that it's not just the binary of yes or no to a story. It's how does the story bend into the prevailing narrative of the moment, or how does it open up and broaden the impending narrative of the moment? I needed to broaden this to female playwrights, to stories with strong women central characters, Asian characters, Latinx characters. The story and the need to expand out of the old summer stock, Noel Coward kind of boulevard comedy that was a brand not just of white America, but of WASP America, became a really compelling part of what we did. And I remember when we opened the what is now called the Mullet-Skidelsky Theater Lab, I have it right behind me. The actor who played a storyteller for me in the first production in the historic stage in 1991, Bill Grimmett, a fabulous African-American DC-based actor who was not only a fine traditional actor, but he was known as a storyteller. And the character he played in Voice of the Prairie was supposed to be an Irish guy, but he did it with an Irish accent, but he had the soul of a storyteller, which is who this character was. And I said, I want Bill playing that role. And he opened the newly renovated historic stage in the 91 production of this play called Voice of the Prairie. And after it was over, to celebrate the opening of the theater, he gave me this wand, and it is from Uganda. And it is a storyteller's wand. And the storyteller's wand is what the storyteller holds when they tell the story to the people who are assembled. And he gave that to me as a sign of respect, and I've treasured it ever since. And in several years later, in '98, when we opened the Mullet Skidelsky, I called Bill and I said, look, we want to do like a dedication of the new space. And he joined me, and we used the Ugandan storyteller wand to kind of bless the new little theater that we built there. And it was a profound experience of how the action of expanding one's artistry can then be applied to the whole culture of how we celebrate even something like the opening of a new building. It's got to get systemic into the roots of how the community thinks and functions. And it's a hard road. Here it is, 2020, we're still having this conversation. And your question, very interesting, about will they come? Yes, but it isn't easy. The kind of radical welcoming that has to happen chronically to overcome generations of systemic division, we're still fighting the good fight, and it has to continue. And maybe now we're facing a reckoning that will actually finally get us over this hurdle in a meaningful way. And that's certainly the hope of programs such as this tonight. Very compelling approach to the story.
So somebody from the audience asked an opinion question. Do you think the theater would have presented To Kill a Mockingbird back in the 1960s?
I do think only because it was connected to the university. If you look at the list of plays that got produced, I know I was flip about talking about the Boulevard comedies, but sprinkled in there were some incredible things. Olney did an absurd festival. Beckett and really out there writers for its time as part of its summer stock fair. I really held on to that part of our tradition to enable our programming to become more sophisticated and in-depth. And I think To Kill a Mockingbird, if it did exist in play form in the 60s, would have been embraced. Yeah, we did it. We did the adaptation in Weldon. You were with us then. I want to say 97, 96, and a highly successful production. I remember how well that show did, and I think we did it in the fall. It was outside of the typical Olney time frame, and we had one of our best successes in a new new time frame for production. So To Kill a Mockingbird was a major milestone in our history.
Well, then, as somebody in sales, you probably hear audience feedback a lot. What kinds of things do you hear about changes that you've seen in 30 years?
It spans the spectrum. A lot of times I'll hear from older folk, and I'll hear murmurings of, this is all new to me, so bear with me, that kind of thing. But then a lot are like, bravo, make it happen. They want to see change. And theater is a good place to take risks and explore things. And it's just such a great start. But, when Jim told a story about we cast a African-American as Michael in Peter Pan. And, people talked about it. But you know what? They talked about it. It made it a much more exciting event to me, because everybody had something to say about it.
That's neat. So one thing we didn't touch on was what happened. Mark, can you tell us what happened to the National Theater when Helen Hayes refused to perform there?
It closed down.
Yeah. Can you explain why?
There was apparently a production of Porgy and Bess early there that the actors found it offensive that Black actors could perform on the stage, but Black audiences couldn't enjoy those performances. So now Steve Cochran was the manager of the National Theater at that time.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what his sentiments were, but he left just about the time that the whole Porgy and Bess thing came down. And he had actually been looking, speaking of the Olney Inn, he had actually been looking at property in the Olney area for a year before he actually purchased the current Olney Theater property. So he had his eye on this area for a long time.
So when did the theater actually open? Can anybody answer that? Like, I guess they just celebrated their 70-something anniversary.
I thought 38.
The pavilion,
Yeah, the first show,
Right, okay.
38.
yeah, the pavilion was built in 38, and the show started then. But as you said, I think C.Y. Stevens bought it in 1940. Does that sound right?
That does sound right.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
He did a lot though. Apparently the first, what Cochran built was almost an outdoor pavilion rather than an enclosed theater. And I think it was Stevens who came along and then on the foundation of the original pavilion built the historic theater. The only instance I could find of its integration was that Stevens sent his Black cook from his house in Laurel to cook for the actors at the theater.
Yeah, I mean, some of the questions we're getting is what does integrated mean? Did it mean Black and white actors, or did it mean that it was open to anybody in the audience?
I think the audience. I think you could always hire Black actors if the play called for it, but integrated theater was more a description of the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And most theaters, if they were integrated, the Blacks were at assigned space in the back, right? The National Theater had all white audiences, but they would have special performances for Black audiences on certain days. But the Black audiences couldn't see the first run productions that were there.
Somebody from the chat says that he remembers that his family would go to the Howard Theater in Shaw.
Yeah, downtown, right? DC. Yeah, yeah, yep. Couldn't do that in Montgomery County.
Somebody said there's a stone cottage on the property and asked about its history.
Yes, the stone cottage, it's still standing there. It's made of quartz from the region. Word had it that it was an old Flying A gas station originally. And then it became basically a little cottage that you could live in, and they added a little kitchen on the back of it. I remember it was shut down, and we did a lot to revamp it. When Ian McKellen came to do Acting Shakespeare in 1986 or 87, we decided, oh, well, we'll make the cottage really nice. And we put geraniums and flower boxes, and we scrubbed the place down, and we did a whole bunch of stuff, and we brought Ian in, and we said, this is for you. And he hated it. Because it was so close to the road, all he could hear was cars, not that there were many, but the cars going by kept him awake. So he moved up to room 1 in the big house, which was actually, we were surprised he found that more acceptable. But because we put all that effort into refurbishing the cottage, we ended up using it as intern houses, and we were able to house about 4 interns and 2 sets of bunk beds in that place. But then it's plumbing system failed, its septic system failed, and I think, Weldon, is that thing pretty much shut
yes,
down now?
shut
Or is
down.
it being used?
It's shut down. It's not.
Yeah, yeah. It's a shame. It's a wonderful, wonderful little structure, but it needs a lot more money than it's worth to save. So, but it still stands there. It still stands there. There was another house that one of the conditions of the bequeathing of the property to Harkey's company, C.Y. Stevens insisted that his sister and her husband, who were the caretakers of the property, the Hefners, Mid and Tom Hefner, they lived in a Sears house that was built to the west side of the historic stage that stood for many, many years. And they spent their whole lives there. And in fact, Tom passed away first, and Mid stayed in that house until she passed away. And then the theater took it over after both of them passed. But it was a condition of the bequest that they should have the right to stay in their home until they either chose to move away or until they passed away. And the Hefner House is what we used to call it. And they were a great part of the community. That house was raised when the new main stage theater went up, that along with the little swimming pool they had in their backyard.
So Mark, this is for you. Somebody commented, they said, Black families have always lived within the Sandy Spring Village in their own homes or on the farms in tenant houses, or some within the homes of Quakers. But I know that you said that they live more on the, more like the edge in between Olney and Sandy Spring.
Yeah, they lived in that, they lived in that space in between Olney and Sandy Spring. It was really, as everybody's attested to, it's extremely rural, rural countryside, undeveloped property, which is the reason they were out there. They were sold little 1 and 2 acre plots, which weren't large enough to farm, which sort of kept the males of the community tied to farm labor, tenant farming, things of that nature. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions from our audience for the speakers? I'm watching the chat. Well, if not, I really want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you so much to our panelists. I know everybody always sticks around for a few minutes and then they ask their question that they don't want anybody else to hear. But thank you so much for sharing your memories with us, and thank you, Mark, for being our
A pleasure to talk about these things.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure.